Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Champaign Public Library and to tonight's award ceremony for our 4th annual short story contest. My name is Salem. I coordinate the Writers Workshop Series, an annual contest. I'm so glad you could join us this evening. Tonight, we'll listen to readings of the top 3 community-submitted stories and find out who will take home the grand prize for Best Short Story this year. I want to take a moment and thank all the writers who submitted in the contest this year. We received 24 stories this year, and so there were so many great stories to choose from. So thank you for sharing your work with us, and keep writing. I'd also like to take a minute to introduce our judges this year. So Andrea Sielicki is currently an MFA fiction candidate at the University of Illinois. In 2021, she studied with Charles Baxter at the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, and in 2022, she was a recipient of the Josephine M. Bresee Memorial Award for short fiction. Originally from Wisconsin, she graduated from Cornell University. Molly MacRae is the award-winning author of the Haunted Yarn Shop Mysteries and the Highland Bookshop Mysteries. As Margaret Welch, she writes for Annie's Fiction. Molly's short stories have appeared in Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine since 1990. And finally, Param Parastaran is an Iranian-American entrepreneur and author with a passion for discussing mental health issues in the business community. In 2018, he chronicled his experiences, both good and bad, in his powerful story, Perfect Pain. Please help me welcome our judges. So without further ado, let's find out who the winning stories are this year. So in 3rd place, winning a 1-year subscription to Writer's Digest magazine and their story published on our website is the story Vacation Home by Drew Adamek. Congratulations, Drew. Drew will now read his story, Vacation Home, followed by feedback from our judges.
A bird crashed with a bloody smack into the picture window overlooking the lake, startling Brian into knocking his coffee cup off the desk. The mug shattered against the floor. Another bird followed, smashing headfirst into the window, exploding in a puff of feathers and blood. A third, flying full speed, slammed against the window and fell to the deck. After a stunned moment, Brian stood up, backed away from the desk, sidestepping the scattered shards of the cup. He tiptoed over the coffee seeping into the white throw rug covering the office floor like an oil spill on a pristine beach and started towards the window. The spreading stain triggered a memory, stopping him short. A shouting match about the rug with his wife. Angry words about priorities and permissions echoed out from the past. How irate she'd be to see him ignoring the mess at his feet. He stared at the rug as his attention drifted backwards, his body tense. What was she thinking? $24,000 for an office rug. We wasted so much. I should burn it in the fire pit, he thought, but the fumes of the synthetic fibers would probably give me cancer. He considered cleaning up the coffee mess, but couldn't afford the distraction. Time was short. He was up early for a few hours of quiet work before he needed to take care of the kids. Regret tugged at him. The sharp crack of another bird hitting the window broke his trance. He turned to see a small red smear running down the glass in a single tear. Pulled away from the past, he walked to the window, pressed his hand against it, cold tingling in his fingertips. He scanned the tree line running down to the lake. Outside, gray morning light fell on leafless, empty trees. In better times, the view from the office was spectacular, but now he only saw birds flying in angry, dark swarms over the lake. Silence. Bird corpses littered the deck outside the window. A robin twitched, the last of its life leaching out. A house sparrow's body, shattered by impact, was nearly unrecognizable as a bird. Brian stumbled backwards as 3 more hit simultaneously with sharp cracks. His scalp itched with tension. This felt personal, like the birds were targeting him, aiming their sharp beaks at his soft middle to burrow deep into his guts. He feared the birds would keep throwing their bodies at the window like a zombie horde at the barricades, pressing forward until the gates fell. Tremors racked his body and he longed to be outside in the open air. He calmed himself with 3 deep breaths. His hands steadied. I can't leave the bodies, he thought. It's disrespectful, but I must wait until this is over. Brian knew it wouldn't take long. The other die-offs took about 6 hours. During die-offs, the animals came in waves, stampeding in open spaces before dying in clusters, bodies twisted together. Last week it was rabbits and squirrels wobbling out of the brush and falling out of trees, shivering and twitching before a final spasm. 3 weeks before, fish thrashed to the lake's surface before dying, leaving an awful stench for days. He was numb to the horror of it. If the birds were like the others, most would die in the first wave, but some would linger. For days, lone rabbits and squirrels staggered into the yard, as if looking for an explanation, before collapsing. Brian stopped cleaning up after the 3rd day. The back lawn was still littered with corpses, stiff and clenched like tight fists. Clusters of birds continued banging into the window. His thoughts spun. The windows won't break, he reassured himself. The burly salesman insisted that the bulletproof, shatterproof, fire-resistant floor-to-ceiling windows would stop anything short of a nuclear blast. For what they cost, Brian assumed that also included kamikaze birds. He hadn't wanted to spend so much on a vacation home, especially not a survivalist cabin, but his father-in-law half convinced him that the disturbances wouldn't stay in the cities forever. The cranky windbag's talk of impending Armageddon seemed like nonsense at the time. There was too much life left and business to do to mind the conspiracies and distant rumblings driving old men crazy then. But the pompous blowhard was right in the end. Well, none of the old man's red-faced predictions came true, ludicrous now considering how things really came apart, but they had needed an escape all the same. It wasn't supposed to be this way. The house was really Sophie's idea. She saw it as a networking opportunity, not a doomsday sanctuary, despite her father's rantings. Many important C-suite types at the country club bought into the development, and she wanted to be among them. It will be a wonderful place to entertain, she said. Imagine taking up partners, potential clients for the weekend. It will be a real showpiece for us. And she was right, too. A luxury survivalist cabin, complete with a 6-month ration supply and a fireproof locker under the deck, and an array of solar batteries, had been a good career investment. Clients loved the wine cave, infinity pool, and vintage arcade game room. Brian closed many lucrative deals with a handshake and a scotch around the lakeside fire pit. Those fireside deals were history now, but the cabin served its purpose as a safe haven when the collapse started. The kids, clinging to their lives in town, hadn't wanted to come at first. Pete complained the internet sucked and Sarah whined about mosquitoes, but that changed after the virus killed their grandfather and a militia firebombed the hospital. Like their parents, the kids felt the madness spreading in the city, and they climbed into the car without complaint on that last trip up. Now insanity had taken over and there was no leaving. Brian didn't care who started it or why, but someone needed to take control and get business restarted. He was desperate to get back to work, to get back to normal, to recapture the comfort and safety of their former lives. But it wasn't panning out that way. Instead, birds were dive-bombing the house and dead bodies littered the yard. So many birds were hitting the house now, not just the windows, that the walls vibrated. It was like sitting inside a bass drum being pounded by an angry teenager. They must be drawn by the heat and lights, he thought. Unable to watch anymore, he returned to work. To drown out the birds' thuds, he found his noise-canceling headphones, spiked the volume, and closed the blinds. Thankfully, the solar batteries had also worked as promised, and his computer was still usable. Today, he was finishing a draft, Strategic Insights newsletter about the firm's stance on restarting business after things returned to normal. The language about the firm's condolences for lost loved ones felt balanced. Acknowledge pain, but don't dwell on the gloomy bits. That would dampen M&A appetite. And now he needed the right words about finding opportunity in tragedy. It was work he could bury himself in. He read his last paragraph aloud. There are upsides to the recent headwinds. Capital-rich buyers will find distressed assets at significant price premiums as markets return, but talent acquisition and consumer demand remain as ongoing strategic concerns. Successful firms will need to focus on automation and digital transformation. The phrasing still felt off, but the comms team would fix it when he could get it to them. Losing himself, he worked on the draft for several hours. He reread what he had written. Bob in Minneapolis would need to check the transportation section after the grid was back up, but that could wait. A few tweaks and the draft was ready to send. He reached under his desk, turned the Wi-Fi router on and off and back on again, hoping that rebooting would catch a connection. The unit flashed red. The internet had been down for weeks, but Brian retried the connection every day in the hopes that someone, somewhere, had fixed it. In the meanwhile, he drafted emails and newsletters to send when the connection was finally reestablished. Clicking the send button, the same daily message flashed. No internet, check your connection. He hit the try again button a dozen times before giving up. Today, the futility of it broke free from his chest and he exploded in a rage. Screaming, he slammed the keyboard down on the desk over and over until the keys flew off. Energized by frustration, he heaved the heavy monitor off the desk, tangling himself up in cords. He fell to the floor and screamed an animal howl, anguish coursing through his body. He curled into a ball and sobbed. When he was fully spent, he noticed the thumping of the birds had died down. The die-off must just be about over. Looking at the mess he had made, the scattered parts strewn about, he realized that the computer was broken beyond repair. He'd have to find Sophie's laptop if he wanted to try getting online again. But maybe he wouldn't bother. As maddening as it was, there had been an upside to losing the internet. Before the grid crashed, the kids stayed in their rooms buried online. Brian and Sophie rarely saw the children in those early days of retreat. Their inability to explain what was happening to the world created an awkward tension that the children avoided with video games and memes. Not that Brian and Sophie were much different. They too hid behind screens in the beginning. Sophie worked nonstop, revising financial forecasts almost hourly as the news got worse, and Brian researched distressed acquisition targets, all alone all day in his office, headphones strapped on. But a month ago, after flickering for several days, the internet finally disappeared. The kids emerged from their rooms, bleary-eyed and grumpy like addicts coming off a binge, and asked Brian to fix it. Nothing worked. Sophie had spent days dialing and redialing the cable company's main line, but eventually she gave up. It took a week to adjust to life without the internet, but slowly the family came together. Sophie organized an Uno tournament. Who knew Pete was such a cutthroat card player? And Brian cleared out the fire pit for nightly campfires. Each night, he and Sophia shared a bottle of red wine, pretending not to notice Sarah sneaking small sips, as the kids told stories about friends they missed. They shared chocolate bars and bags of hard candy. Those nights felt safe and worry-free, despite everything happening on the other side of the mountains. It was the first time Brian remembered being truly free and happy with his family. Lying on his office floor, he began to cry again. The night the horizon exploded, 10 days ago maybe, his sense of time was slipping, was the best night they had shared. Pete helped him gather firewood, big armloads of sticks from around the yard, and they had a roaring fire going. The girls brought out a pan of brownies, and Sarah showed off a new dance routine. A sly look Brian hadn't seen since college crossed Sophie's face. Then the color of the night changed. Sophie saw it first. "Look," she said, pointing west. An orange light silhouetted the mountain range. "That's got to be coming from Springfield," Sophie murmured. The orange glow seeped upwards, spreading like a fragile bubble towards a starless sky. Sophie grabbed Brian's hand and squeezed. "What is that?" she whispered, her fear obvious. "Oh my God, Mom, chill. It's just a giant pimple on Katie Palicki's forehead," Sarah squealed. "If she doesn't take care of it, it's going to pop all over the mountains." Pete choked on a brownie, spitting out chunks as he laughed. No, wait. "It's a school lasagna that someone left in the oven too long and now it's alive," Pete said through laughter. That broke the tension and they all joined in. No. It's a water balloon someone left on the faucet, filling up for the last 3 months," Brian added. Even Sophie chimed in with comic possibilities for the orange haze. They made jokes for an hour, prodding each other on to sillier extremes, until the sky returned to black, and then they thought no more of it. Entertained for the night, Brian and Sophie sent the kids to bed. In bed later, a hopeful hand on Sophie's hip, Brian contemplated the disaster on the horizon. Whatever it was, it wouldn't reach them. Even if there was a catastrophe in Springfield, no one could get here from there. The Buckley boys had destroyed the river bridge, the only road into the enclave, to keep out the virus. Newcomers never appeared after that. Anyone escaping the cities in the west would need to hike over mountains and swim across the lake to get to the enclave, only to face bunkers fully stocked with arms and ammunition. 100 square miles of national forest buffeted the enclave on 3 sides. It was truly an island, protected from the calamities befalling the outside world. Brian slept deeply that night. No more. He slept fitfully since Sophie and the kids died 3 days ago. It was the same with them as it was with the other animals. Agitated mania followed by a mad dash into an open space. The 3 of them thrashing in a pile of arms, legs, and horrified screams in the backyard while Brian watched them die. Sarah first, then Pete, Sophie. Brian willed himself off the office floor. It was time. He avoided the inevitable for too long. The internet wasn't coming back, business was over, his family gone, this house ridiculous, safety an illusion. His tremors and cramps worsening. It was all over. He went downstairs on heavy legs, poured himself a large scotch from the most expensive bottle in his collection, and walked outside. Thin ribbons of pale smoke wound seductively around the trees. A few birds circled erratically above. Brian's eyes stung as he walked to the fire pit. He picked up the chairs, arranged them in a circle in their usual way, and went to his family. They lay entwined near the pool. Sarah, her face contorted from the suffering of her final hours. Pete, so small and light for a 10-year-old. Sophie, her arms clutching the children. Brian dragged each to their chair. Pete's always too close to the fire, pulling and bending them as much as he could to get them comfortable. When they were in all their garish, horrifying positions, Brian sat down. "Show me your dance again," he said to Sarah. "You looked so beautiful the last time." He took a long pull of scotch and waited for disaster to finally reach him.
Should I start? Thank you for that lovely reading. What I really love about this story is that, one, I love your choice to have Brian work in finance and be this like acquisitions analyst looking for opportunities in disaster. I think that's very fitting and like perfect for this story. And I also love this juxtaposition of this survivalist cabin, and he's there with his family. And during those times when it's just the four of them together, it's the happiest times of his life. And he's really like enjoying and soaking up in the moment. And you can tell that in his kind of normal life, he did not have that, and that family aspect maybe was not there in the way that it is when they're together in this cabin, which is then leading up into the worst moments of his life in this 3 days. The way the story opens with this kind of eeriness feeling of the bird and then slowly unravels, I think the pacing was just working really well. And I love that he doesn't have internet for weeks, but it's like that's hidden, and we just see him kind of working on these investment documents or newsletter, and then we're told that he doesn't have internet. I find that funny and sad and true of this kind of person who Brian is. So yeah, thank you.
It was really good. The story opens with a literal smack and doesn't let up, and Brian is believable and empathetic character. You cleverly and seamlessly brought in backstory that answers some of our questions, but not enough so that we keep reading. You set the scene with wonderful deft brush strokes, like he turned to see a small red smear running down the glass in a single tear, and with details like, what was she thinking, $24,000 for an office rug? That line is great use of conflict and tension. But as smooth as your brush strokes and details are, they smack the reader like the poor bird smacking into the window. They make the reader ask, what? 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 We want to know what's happening, but even better, we want to know what's going to happen next. And the sense of foreboding you build absolutely drags the readers forward. We know something isn't right, and then it gets worse, and then it gets even worse. And the revelation at the end is a real good Lord moment, and you earned it.
Really good story. First off, it's important to say I'm not a person that reads fiction almost at all. So it's very interesting for me to read it, and the cadence and the way he did it. But this particular one was very easy for me to read, and I was able. I think you said the same thing. I was really able to get in the character, to his character, and like I could feel him. I can kind of be him. I can kind of feel what was going on. I think a lot of it had to do with the way you were writing, and very descriptive of kind of putting me in that in that house. And so I thought that was really good. And then overall, just the story, the idea in a short amount of time of sort of taking us through where you did. I was. It's a little dark, but it was really good, because at first I kind of didn't know where it was going, and then which is the best part, is you're kind of wondering, like, I almost want to get to the end, and then the end was absolutely for me, it was surprising. It was very surprising for me, and I think that's a good thing. But yes, overall, it was very well written, very easy to read, and it just had a thing where you had to go a little bit farther because I just had to know a little bit more, and I think that's a good thing.
Great, thank you.
Congratulations again, Drew. Moving on to our second place prize. So in second place, also winning a one-year subscription to Writers Digest magazine and their story published on our website, is the story Thank You for Giving 110% by Bethan Owen. Bethan will now read her story, followed again by feedback from our judges.
Hey, Betty. Betty didn't look up. She'd been sitting at her desk, hunched forward until her nose was almost touching its scarred surface, and really, she thought that should have been enough of a hint that she didn't want to talk. Her desk was an amalgamation of surfaces that had been forced together into a makeshift workspace, but the part that was currently under her nose, the part that used to be a school desk, was her favorite. J plus M, it said, then J plus L, J plus D, J plus J. She liked to wonder what had become of J and their many paramours, and whether the final J plus J represented J's eventual self-acceptance and the end of their quest for love. Betty. Betty looked up. It was Jim, of course, always Jim, with his wonky reading glasses and his thin hair that he continued trying to scrape over his whole head, even though the metal plate that started just behind his ear and continued around the curve of his head like a shining silver beret was always going to be obvious. Betty knew that they were supposed to leave their outside identities behind when they stepped into the workplace. They were supposed to wear business casual attire whenever that attire was available and intact, and adopt an attitude of civility. But Jim took it too far. He always acted as though he was working among a bunch of savages and hadn't, just like the rest of them, survived a nuclear apocalypse and probably eaten a few people to do so. He even had a white button-up shirt that he wore on very special occasions. What, Jim? Gabe is looking for you. Betty's stomach sank. She had known that Gabe would be looking for her, but hearing Jim confirm it was enough to turn her apprehension into something closer to real anxiety. Jim could see it on her face. She knew he could, especially when he gave her a smarmy smile and a wink. Don't worry, it's the nice Gabe. The Gabes are all clones, Jim. Don't act like you can tell them apart, Betty snapped. She pushed a pile of papers together angrily on her desk and pretended she didn't see Jim still smirking in the corner of her eye. Across the cubicle divider wall, Betty saw Donna's head pop up and stare inquisitively down at her. Donna was missing an eye, and sometimes seemed to forget that even though she couldn't see much on her left side, it was still obvious when she was staring. Betty lowered herself in her chair and pretended to work until there was the sound of a door opening and Gabe's familiar voice in the air. "Hello, employees," he said, with that all-American accent that only seemed to exist in this office and in very old movies. He turned on his heel, scanning the room. Betty fought the urge to literally drop under her desk, the way she would have in the outside if someone had been looking for her with that level of intensity in their eyes. She settled for slumping deep into her office chair, which betrayed her with a squeak and a groan. "Betty!" She braced herself. It was happening. "Betty, would you mind stepping into the hall with me?" Slowly, begrudgingly, Betty lifted her eyes to his. "For a chat," Gabe said, unaffected, smiling his angelic all-American smile. Betty took a long, lingering glance around the room, aware that it might be her last. She drank in the beige-colored floors and the beige-colored cubicles and the dingy gray ceiling. She often found herself wishing that the ceiling was beige, too, to really complete the cocoon-like feeling of the office. The only other place where the beige color was interrupted was the large and ominous stain splattered in one corner. It refused to scrub out, and so someone had covered it with a battered artificial plant. Betty loved that plant and the way its four frayed and papery leaves clung ferociously to artificial life. She cast her eyes around at her office mates, and although she would certainly miss them less than the artificial plant, they had their charms, she thought. She could probably miss Donna's friendly empty eye socket and the pictures of her giant two-headed pet rat pinned to her cubicle wall. And then there was Heidi, with her constant stream of entertaining gossip about Donna and the way she still sometimes snacked on forbidden irradiated snack food because she liked the tangy taste. Jim, with his stupid comb-over and aggressive mouth-breathing. And Jerry, Betty thought, narrowing her eyes as she stared at the top of Jerry's head. There was also Jerry. "Betty," Gabe said, paternal, admonishing. Betty marched into the hall, avoiding Jim's stare and trying to hold this moment in her mind as long as possible, the moment before the good times ended. The door closed behind her, and the air suddenly smelled like dust and smoke instead of Jerry's instant coffee. It was a stretch to call the space outside the office a hall. It had been a hall once, almost definitely, but now it was more of a collection of bricks, rebar, and a few window frames. A tarp that served as the roof flapped cheerfully overhead. There were yellowing, laminated motivational posters on some of the wall fragments that Betty always enjoyed reading as she walked by. "We're all in this together, so let's have some fun with it," one said. Another, "Give it 110%. One simply yelled, "Teamwork." "So how are things going, Betty?" Gabe asked. She could feel him smiling at the side of her head, and reluctantly she turned to look at him in his loose white shirt and miraculously unblemished khaki pants. He had been genetically engineered to be handsome and charming. Betty knew all this, and yet his charisma still pulled her in. The dimples at the corners of his mouth were a particularly aggravating touch. "Great," she said, "really great." "But that's not entirely true, is it, Betty?" Gabe asked. Now his voice was gentle. He wasn't calling her a liar, only teasing out a few things she'd left unsaid. "These genetically engineered clones are good at the jobs they were genetically engineered to do," Betty thought darkly, even as she opened her mouth and confessed. "I've been feeling a bit upset lately." Gabe nodded, slow, deep nods, his forehead wrinkled in concern for her. "Tell me more about that." "Jim is driving me crazy," Betty said. They had walked far enough that the hallway had ended unceremoniously between two piles of rubble that had probably once been the main entrance. There was a rusted decorative gate, but it was more for show than anything. The Gabes were the real security. Betty had seen what the Gabes did to intruders, and the evidence they left behind was more of a deterrent than any gate could be. "He nitpicks my work," Betty continues. "He smirks. He whistles when he breathes out of his nose." "What else?" My chair is starting to make my back hurt. And," she said, feeling the well of deep rage inside her threatening to erupt, "Jerry always says it's Monday Fun Day on Mondays." "That does sound aggravating," Gabe said. "It's the first thing he does, every Monday morning." They stood at the end of the hallway and stared out into the bare, dusty land beyond. The earth and sky blended together in different shades of brown, with only a few shriveled trees in the distance to suggest where the ground ended and the air began. Betty took another step forward and peered around the low, broken wall. The boxes of paperwork that they produced in the office were there, as always. When a box got too full, one of the Gabes would empty it, and the papers would swirl away in the wind so the box could be filled with their work again. It was satisfying, the regular filling and emptying of the boxes. She'd come to love having a goal that was always just out of reach and never put her life on the line. But wasn't there something else? "Not really," Betty said testily. "Go on, it's just us out here," Gabe said, smiling, and Betty was confessing again before she even realized she had started. "I told Jerry that if he said Monday Fun Day again, I would put his head on a pike and throw the pike into the sun." And a few other remarks. And I grabbed his ears and pulled fairly hard. "Betty," Gabe said, and she could hear the bad news in his voice. She turned to look at him, and the sorrowful expression on his face had deepened. "I understand your reaction, and I find Jerry very grating myself," Gabe said, putting his hands behind his back and gazing solemnly out into the distance. "Just because a phrase rhymes is no reason to repeat it ad nauseum." "Thank you," Betty said triumphantly. "But you know, we have to be very strict about keeping out-of-control emotions out of the workplace," he said. To her credit, Betty did not feel any out-of-control emotions in that moment, just a small sadness. "There's plenty of room on the outside for emotions and passions," Gabe said. "In the outside, you can put people's heads on pikes and throw them into the sun all you want." How did his teeth stay so white, Betty wondered as she smiled back at him. "But you know what this place is for," he said. "This is a calm place, a place of control. This place is the opposite of the outside. We've managed to capture the repetitive mundanity of pre-war capitalism, and it can heal souls if it's left uninterrupted." He turned to look at her again. "I'm afraid you've interrupted it." "I didn't even come close to taking his head off," Betty said. She could hear the whine in her own voice. "I'm afraid even that is too far," Gabe said. Now his voice was firm. Betty felt her temper rising. "Listen, Betty, These little sanctuaries have to keep the wildness out. People need these spaces. They need to fill out paperwork and throw it away. They need to drink bad instant coffee and have little disputes with their cubicle mates, because the alternative is joining a tie-dye cannibal clan. Betty remembered a run-in she'd had with the tie-dye cannibal clan. It had stuck with her. But some people do better in the outside, he went on, and there's no shame in that. I remember when you came to us, I had the impression that you had done pretty well for yourself out there. I did, Betty said, and she felt a little stirring of pride that she'd forgotten about over the past few months in the office. I was the best rat furrier for miles. Don't tell Donna, she said. So maybe it's better for you out there, and maybe it's not. And maybe it's not. You can always come back in a few weeks and try to pass the entrance tests again. People do that. There's more back and forth than you'd expect. Betty sighed. It seems like we should just be able to have both. Can't we have both? Well, we tried that for a while, Gabe said, waving his hand at the dead earth around them. The wind carried a stinging layer of sand over their feet. The air was growing humid. There was a smell of acid rain. Can I go back and get my things? Betty asked. I'm afraid not, Gabe replied. Betty found herself taking slow breaths, trying to calm down, and then stopped herself. Why should she calm down? If you want, you can fight me as a farewell from the office, Gabe said graciously. Many people say it's both a cathartic work experience and a good preparatory session for re-entry into the outside. He was rolling up his sleeves in preparation. He smiled again, but now Betty could see through it. He wasn't really offering her a gift. He didn't really care about her. Had he ever lived outside? She doubted it. She was beginning to remember her old self, the fiercer one that could live off of nothing but a cache of 200-year-old Twinkies for weeks, or fend off a flock of seagulls with a ballpoint pen. The black plastic bag that she had so proudly fashioned into a pencil skirt began to feel sweaty and restrictive. How about it? Gabe asked again. He had his hands on his hips. He looked as mild and content as ever. All he had to think about was when to empty the next box of papers, or when to tell Heidi that her perfume was beginning to overwhelm the office again. No, Betty said, turning away with what she hoped was a noble expression. No, I don't want to leave on a note of... She turned and sprang at him before her sentence was finished with a scream of exhilaration, and whether or not she'd truly caught him off guard, she did manage to bite his forearm hard. They had a good fight. She lost, as they had both known she would. It was common knowledge on the outside that you should never fight a clone. But Gabe had struck a pleasant middle ground of not incapacitating her while not taking it easy on her either. And when he physically threw her into the dust outside the office building, she was bruised and a bit bloody, but mostly she was sky high on adrenaline. Gabe was affably wielding the long arm of a rusty paper cutter that he had picked up from the debris outside the building, just to let her know he was serious about her not getting back in. It shone red and orange in the hazy light, and he looked particularly handsome there, in his clean white shirt, with his head of loose curls silhouetted against the burnt brown sky. Good luck out there, Betty, Gabe said with a smile, and when she gave a particularly feral scream and a laugh as he closed and locked the gates, he winked at her. Give it 110%.
Thank you for that reading. I love the premise of this story. The humor is working so well. These kind of like small images, but that do a lot of work in the story, like the artificial plant, the beige, the coworker with the one eye, the picture of the pet rat, the tarp flapping, and this like the acid rain moving in. All of these things are really juxtaposing nicely the idea of this like very civil office and trying to keep civility, and the fact that Betty only has this, Gabe to kind of tell her grievances to, who's supposed to be this like sympathetic character, but who actually nobody can win in a fight and actually would do better outside of the office maybe than all of the other people in the office. And I just love the like heightened maybe truth behind this idea of like an office being this civil place. We're all trying to pretend the outside world is not really existing as much, and we're just trying to tone down the things that are actually in our reality in the way that it's kind of the stereotypical office doesn't allow for that. So just really interesting themes that you're working with, and I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. In the first two sentences of your story, each just one word dropped the reader immediately into a sizzle of tension and conflict. It's like, hey, Betty. And the tension and conflict don't let up from there. And We know from the outset what Betty wants. She doesn't want us to talk to Jim, especially to Jim. And we know, of course, there's a bigger want out there too. And the question of whether she'll get either drags the reader through to the end. It drags us through revelation after revelation, each one adding to our grasp of the setting, each one adding to our understanding and unease. Like your one-word sentences at the beginning of the story, sometimes your revelations come in a single word like intact. You know, they were supposed to wear business casual attire whenever that attire was available and intact. You have really nice turns of phrase throughout the story. After introducing us to the artificial plant, you say, Betty loved that plant, and the way its four frayed and papery leaves clung ferociously to artificial life. I also like the phrases aggressive mouth breathing and tie-dyed cannibal clam. Your story is wonderfully memorable and with a strangely hopeful ending. And the whole thing is wicked fun. Thank you for writing it.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the stuff they already said that I would have said, but real specifically, you know, let me go back to the characters. Obviously, Betty's real likable. She's real funny, kind of digger. And Gabe reminds me of, I don't know if you guys remember I think it was called Office Space. You know, the boss that talked real slow. And so when I was reading this, I picture Office Space a little bit in this. So that was cool. Obviously, the writing was good. You guys did a much better job of being real specific in why it was good, but I agreed with everything with that. I don't know if you intended this. Obviously, it's meant to be. It's funny, but for me, and maybe it's my psychological mind, but I also saw a very serious, complex underbelly to this, with the sort of the inside out and the societal sort of complexity to this. And I don't know if that was your intention of how what you were intending to that, but that's the one thing I really liked about it, that it was light up here and funny, and I could be there and I can kind of get it. But I think it really, maybe there was this other thing with the clone and then somebody being outside world and this more of a deeper societal complexity to it, but which is why I liked it a lot. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, I appreciate it.
And now it's time to find out who will take home the prize for the winning story, first place, for Best Short Story in 2022. So in first place, winning a one-on-one consultation with Ted Sanders, who is the Director of Creative Writing in the Department of English at the University of Illinois, an annual membership to Masterclass for online writing courses, and a professional headshot for their author portfolio. And their story, published on our website, is the story Stumble by Jessica Lanius.
In the wet, early October, when combines began to crawl the fields like prehistoric beasts, the universe stumbled. And while the Harvey Public Library took weeks to learn it suddenly owned 2 identical copies of Danielewski's House of Leaves, and Perry Nelson believed his larger-than-normal harvest a blessing from God, Hannah Dupont discovered the plurality of her husband fairly quickly when she awoke to both of them screeching at each other in the living room. Stumbling from the bedroom with a deeply pregnant wobble, Mrs. Dupont rubbed her eyes as Sebastian, her Sebastian, messy and wrinkled from sleeping on the sofa, jabbed his finger and screamed incomprehensibly at yet another Sebastian, her Sebastian, prim and dressed from work, who shook his head and screamed similarly incomprehensibly. They both looked at her, eyes wide and feral, and she joined their screaming. The formal naming of the 2 Sebastians happened the following morning. 1 and 2 seemed easy labels, but one would always read as superior. The same consequence occurred for alpha and beta, primary and secondary. Eventually, they both quietly agreed to monochrome wardrobes, settling on green and blue. Amelia Navarro, the evening desk manager at the Sleepyside Inn, was naturally not involved in these conversations. though she would have proposed simply naming them after their room numbers, 111 and 225. The 26-year-old prided herself in her ability to scale down complexities, and it came as no surprise she quickly gained a handle on the two Sebastians. When it became clear the pair were neither hoax nor crime, they were released from police custody and shuffled to the sleepy side, because no one could quite determine if it was reasonable to send them home. Here, they maintained a suggested distance from each other, because no one could quite determine if it was safe for them to communicate. No one could quite determine anything, except the two 31-year-olds were identical. Straight down to their fingerprints, reported the Evening Torch. Undoubtedly the same person, they carried a single divergence in memory. Blue Sebastian took the bus home from work, fought with his wife, and then conceded to sleeping on the couch. Green Sebastian left work, chose instead to walk home, detoured to Ollie's place for a burger, and eventually returned home to find himself already asleep on the sofa. Sometime and some screaming later, their wife phoned the police. Well, she couldn't technically be the wife to both of them, but she was clearly the wife of Sebastian Dupin. It was just now there were two Dupins and no one really knew what to do about it. At the sleepy side, Amelia only encountered them in the singular, but they mirrored each other. Blue Sebastian came downstairs the first night to ask for additional pillows, all bright pink cheeks and repeated thanks, and left just as Green Sebastian phoned with the same request. On the second night, Green called to ask after a comb. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to do about personal items when I packed. I didn't want to be rude and take the only one." And she ran one up to his room. Blue phoned an hour later. "I hate to bother you, but do you happen to have a spare comb? I didn't grab mine from home. I wasn't sure it was mine." When Green called on the third night to request additional toilet paper, Amelia grabbed 4 rolls, partly because she anticipated a second request and partly because she despised the door to the supply closet. Housed in the stall of the men's lobby bathroom, the closet handle stuck. And though she thought she'd learned its secret, knock twice just northwest of the handle and then quickly twist, sometimes it still managed to trick her. After delivering 2 rolls to 111, she hustled up to 225, where Blue smiled gratefully at her offer. "I was just about to call you." Amelia did not worry about the time spent managing these echoing requests, because the two Dupins remained her only guests. Everyone else, reporters, gawkers, out-of-state lawyers attempting to parse how the law worked when one person suddenly became 2, were forced to the Quality Inn. So she kept the lobby door locked and puzzled through Sudokus during shifts. Green Sebastian did not think of himself as Green Sebastian, because doing so implied an acceptance of this fragmented state. He didn't think of Blue Sebastian as Blue Sebastian either. He was just the him who was not him but was in fact him. Green Sebastian found himself overwhelmed when trying to clarify pronouns, and often rested his cheek against the cold hotel window in the same way he used to in the teenage months following his father's departure. The action brought a small comfort now, though only because the rain smeared the ever-present press in the parking lot. He wanted Hannah. 4 days ago at the police station, she cradled her stomach, worried at her bottom lip, and whispered at him to come clean, please. "Please, Sebastian, this isn't funny." "I don't know what's happening," he told her then, and it remained true. Only she'd gone to her mother's and suggested he give her a few days to decompress. Decompression sounded lovely but unachievable here. He missed his wife. He missed feeling his unborn daughter kick against his palms. He missed wandering into the kitchen at midnight to fill a glass of water and stare into their backyard, wondering what it would look like with a swing set. Was Hannah still his wife? And what of their daughter? Did the kitchen, the glassware, the backyard still belong to him? When dread like this crept into his life pre-Blue Sebastian, he would lie down on the floor of their living room and stare up at the ceiling fan, counting his breaths in rotations. If he remained on the floor when Hannah came home, she slowly brought the house to life again with noises. Water running to fill the kettle, the steady thud of knife on wood as she chopped vegetables for supper. With tea brewed, she brought the tray to the living room, made herself a cup, and sat as witness until he drew enough of himself back into his body to get up and drink with her. Green Sebastian needed to lie down on the floor now, but refused to do that in a hotel where some previous guest's beard trimmings littered the vanity drawers. He walked the length of the room, listening to the rain as he clenched and opened his palms. The clamp around his throat remained. He paced once more, then opened the door to the hall. Rain pattered against the windows of the sleepy side while Amelia sat cross-legged on the floor, dark hair tucked behind ears, sorting puzzle pieces into middles and edges. Footsteps on the stairs, 2:25. "Evening," she greeted with a smile as Blue Sebastian stepped into the lobby, somehow askew without a single hair out of place. He cradled a mug in his hands. "I hope I'm not bothering you," he said, looking down at her. Amelia's cheeks reddened as she rose quickly. "No, not at all." She brushed off her pants. "I'm sorry, just passing the time." A gust of wind rattled one of the panes. "No, you don't have to apologize," Blue said, looking down into his mug. "I just wondered if maybe you had a microwave. I wanted tea, maybe, but I didn't want to use the kettle in my room and—" He cut off, looking behind her to the hallway that led to the 100s. Last February, Amelia slipped on ice outside the sleepy side while walking to her car. Ice she noted before stepping onto it regardless. The pre-existing evaluation did not lessen the shock that tensed through her body when she lost traction. Turning around and seeing both Sebastians caused the same constriction in her chest. She knew there were two, of course she knew there were two, but that knowledge was held in a much different place than the visual of the same man writ twice. "Oh," both Sebastians and Amelia said. They didn't belong here. Amelia's brain knew that fact, but it did not clarify if here meant this lobby or the sleepy side or this existence. The universe felt both much smaller and much, much larger to Amelia as she watched both Sebastians stare at each other. "Can we?" one of the Sebastians started, and then they both moved in a way that appeared as dance. Both men who were technically one man, but simultaneously, inarguably two men, locked themselves in the lobby bathroom before Amelia could wonder if this was permitted. The rain roared to a downpour. The lobby bathroom of the sleepy side felt clean in only a technicality. Yes, it smelled faintly of bleach. No, not a single water droplet marred the mirror. But this small space, with wood-paneled walls, off-white urinals, and a singular unsteady stall, felt perpetually dirty to both Sebastians. The sound of rain still reached this interior room, and both men listened to it, while the gravity of being alone together for the first time pulled them securely to the floor. "I think it would be easier if," Blue Sebastian started, meeting Green's eyes in the wall-length mirror. "Yes," Green Sebastian agreed, nodding at Blue's reflection, and both iterations of Sebastian Dupin first washed their hands, then faced the mirror. Perceiving his duplicate through a mirror still felt like staring at the sun, but this buffer served as sunglasses. The extended exposure was still likely to cause lasting damage, but the effects weren't immediate. He could pretend instead he was looking at himself. "Hi," said Blue Sebastian. "Hi," replied Green Sebastian. The yellowed lights hummed in quiet soundtrack. "You would think this celebrity would get us better accommodations," Green Sebastian said, folding his arms over his chest to keep his now clean hands protected. "Would be nice," Blue Sebastian replied, sticking his hands into his jeans pockets. They met eyes, and neither admitted they were paying for two people and a single salaried bank account. Green thought about how every penny spent on Blue was a penny his daughter would never see. Blue thought about how every dollar spent on Green was $1 away from Hannah. Then both men reversed thoughts, and both men sighed, and both men looked at their own reflection, and then at the reflection that matched their own but wasn't. "We don't," Green Sebastian started, but they finished the sentiment together. "Work." Blue made a soft sound and shuffled his feet. The first rumble of thunder breached the atmosphere and echoed in his chest. "What did you say to her?" Green asked quietly, looking to Blue, to the floor, to Blue. He hadn't been there, of course. He returned home later, after wandering and eating and more wandering. But they were the same. And in the moments after Blue arrived home to Hannah, Their divergence was minimal. Green knew what he could have said. Blue tucked his chin, looked at the sink faucet upon which a single bead of water formed slowly. It would drop soon. I wasn't going to say anything, Blue said, but she'd started painting the nursery. I didn't know we'd decided on a color. We didn't, Green Sebastian murmured, having seen the half-painted nursery when he'd returned home to pack a bag. At that time, it stirred a great sense of despair, loss of this choice that should have been made together, a fear he is now unable to make choices again. Right, Blue affirmed, but Hannah decided to do this herself, and I was so tired from work, and it looked in that moment like she didn't need me. Rain on the building almost drowned his words. Like, what was I doing here? Because I don't know how to be a dad, and maybe she's right to do this all without me because maybe I'll just mess it up. Maybe it's in my genes to mess this up. Another roll of thunder. You're not Dad, Green Sebastian said. Blue Sebastian looked at him. We're not Dad. The water droplet purling on the faucet dropped. Amelia stood in the monochrome lobby of the Sleepy Side and stared at the bathroom door. She prided herself in her ability to scale down complexities, and while the issue here seemed to be the existence of two Sebastians, she realized upon seeing them the issue lay in their simultaneous existence, which sounded like the same thing, but fundamentally was not. Thunder rumbled, and she stepped over her forgotten puzzle to the door. They looked at each other in the mirror. I'm scared, one Sebastian whispered. Me too, replied the other. A knock on the door. 20 minutes later, the door to the lobby bathroom of the Sleepy Side opened. Only a singular Sebastian stood inside, stripped down to plain black boxers, identical to the pair on the floor beside him. 35 minutes later, Sebastian stood beneath the awning of the Sleepy Side, rain now sprinkling, and rewarded the night owl journalists with news that the mystery had concluded. He claimed when he and the other Sebastian hugged, they merged and became one. When asked which Sebastian he was, he said he was both. An hour later, Amelia and her boss explained the bathroom had no alternative exit, not unless a Sebastian shrunk to squeeze through a vent or a drain. 4 hours later, uninterrupted video footage of two Sebastians entering the bathroom and one Sebastian leaving the bathroom aired on the local station, soon to be picked up by national news. In the footage, Amelia stood outside the bathroom door, seeming to offer compassion, though no audio could be heard around the thunder. 1 day later, Sebastian returned home, apologized to his wife, and spent the next 10 hours in near silence with her. 3 days later, they painted the nursery together. Amelia Navarro no longer had trouble with the supply closet in the men's lobby bathroom. It opened easily for her, though it appeared no one else on staff quite had her luck. Sebastian visited Amelia at the Sleepy Side often. He always used the bathroom before he left and emerged stretching, rolling his shoulders, thanking Amelia. Amelia once overheard a pair of teenage boys whispering and jostling each other about a ghost they'd heard while using the lobby toilet. A shuffling sound, a bit of wood creaking, a sound like breathing from the closet. She assured them old buildings were prone to pests. The Harvey Public Library eventually attributed their duplicated copy of House of Leaves as a catalog error. A new barcode permitted both copies to enter circulation without issue. Some things are much less complicated than humans. Thank you.
Thank you. Few things that I admired about your story. I really enjoyed the book ending with the House of Leaves and that image paired with what the story actually is about. I thought that was a smart choice and kind of clever way to frame the story. I also was really impressed by the point of view and how it's kind of this like distant remove, but it also shifts and we get interiority from lots of different characters. We have Amelia, we have Green and Blue, and then we also kind of have like the town presence and this like newspaper presence So just, moving that around and moving the reader between these different points of view is not easy to do. So I was impressed by that. And then I really enjoyed just kind of the hidden mystery. We start with this mystery, and it pulls you through the whole story. And then the answer that's kind of blatantly given, that's the one that reported by the newspapers, is not actually, the maybe real answer to this mystery, but you're going to have to read more carefully and understand the secretness behind that to kind of get the real answer. So that was really satisfying as a reader.
Thank you. I love the music of your long single-sentence opening paragraph. And I love the dry humor throughout and the little surprises at the ends of your paragraphs. I love the end wrap of the conclusion, like she said. Readers immediately know when, how, what, and who, and that's a hallmark of a well-crafted story. And you set up the situation so well that the reader doesn't feel the need to know why the universe stumbled or why Sebastian is affected. You carry readers along with deft character and scene development until we're left with the question of will. Will the Sebastian's predicament be fixed? And a second how can it be fixed? Your story answers those questions beautifully. We have Amelia working in the background who, like any good evening desk manager, is a problem solver. And Amelia is someone I would love to know. At the end, we're left with a third how. How is the solution going to work long term? We're also left with the slight worry that now that we know the universe can stumble, will it happen again? But the disquiet from those worries only adds to the story's pleasure. Stumble is a neat package, well written and completely satisfying.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I liked you reading it. So is that a bad thing that I liked you reading it more than me reading it? But hopefully it's not. But no, I really did actually like you reading it. I had to read this one twice. The first time I read it, it just there was a lot going on, and there was a lot going on, and then I felt like I was wanting to figure out what's happening and use my imagination. It was very clever. So the story, just bottom line, it was a very clever story. But then as I was reading it, I'm trying to solve it and trying to understand this duality, this two Sebastian idea, and of course the lenses that I look through stuff a lot of times is psychology. So then it became really fascinating for me because I was like, ooh, these two psychological people within one person. And so that part was really interesting, but it really just made me want to get to the end. I just wanted to get to the end and figure out what is going on. And I think that's a good thing, but obviously well written, that part is very obvious. But and then I like the use of Amelia in the way you use it, and specifically the part where you talk about how she likes to take complex things and make them simple, and it really was fitting into this story. So really good.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations, Jessica. I want to thank everyone for coming and celebrating this year's winners. I want to congratulate our three winners again, Jessica, Bethan, and Drew. I also want to once again thank our judges, Andrea Sielicki, Molly MacRae, and Param Parastaran. Thank you for coming and have a good evening.